Okay. There, it's 12 o'clock. It's Wednesday. That means it's time for the Iowa Learning Farms webinar. And so, really thankful to be here today and be able to host the webinar. And think we have a great topic for the week of Thanksgiving. Important for us to look back at some of our history. So today we have Curt Meine. Curt is a senior fellow with the Aldo Leopold Foundation and Center for Humans and Nature. He's going to talk about Paul Johnson. For those that may not be as familiar, Paul Johnson was a longtime leader in conservation and land stewardship. I think as we think about things in Iowa, we owe Paul and individuals like him a debt of gratitude for the work that they did, and certainly the work that that they did in many areas. But one thing is the Iowa Groundwater Protection Act that was passed in the 80s, passed when I was just a high schooler, but it's had a lasting impact as I think about the work that we've done at Iowa State University and other areas. As part of that, one of the items was the ag management account that was a fee on fertilizer in the state of Iowa, and that really has gone toward funding a lot of research over the years, both from IDALS, the Leopold Center, Iowa Nutrient Research Center, among other things. And I was thinking about this before, the list of practices that have been developed uh, with kind of seed funding a lot of times from those sources. Information on cover crops, riparian buffers, the work that Dick Schultz and Tom Eisenhart did, wetlands, saturated buffers, bioreactors, multi-purpose oxbows. I think we have a lot to be proud of and thankful for the people that have, for the people that were instrumental in passing the Iowa Groundwater Protection Act, but also for those that have done work since then on research in other areas. So nobody came today to hear me, but we're going to hear about Paul Johnson's legacy from Curt Meine. As always, if you have questions or comments, please type those into the chat box, and we'll get those to Curt at the end of his talk. With that, Curt, the virtual floor is all yours.
All right. Let's just make sure that the tech is all working. You can hear me,
I can,
Matt?
I can hear you great.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thank you to the Learning Farms for inviting me. This is a program I wasn't aware of until my friend Steve Hopkins, who I'm sure many of you know, um, told me about it and I guess put my name in. So I'm really delighted and I really appreciate you and Steve and all of you out there, however many you are, who are carrying on in your own way some of the legacy that Paul helped to give us. Happy Thanksgiving to everyone. So, uh, thanks again, especially for taking a little break perhaps in your preparation. Just a couple caveats. It's a very snowy, windy day over here in Wisconsin where I live. And I live in a rural area, and if a tree falls on a power line, I could go blank on you. It can happen. And in addition, being in a rural area, sometimes I'm prone to freezing on my internet. So if I go quiet for a few seconds, that's why it usually kicks back in after a few seconds. So with all that said, again, thank you for inviting me to join you and to talk about this new book just published earlier in the fall of Paul Johnson's writings by Ice Cube Press in Iowa City. I've been on the road and in Iowa a lot in the last few weeks in Decorah and Des Moines and Ames. I'll be in Dubuque. I'll be in Iowa City in a couple weeks. So I'm back in Iowa a lot and really have appreciated reconnecting with a lot of friends and colleagues. So if we were in person, I would for a show of hands and ask how many people knew Paul Johnson and worked with him. And I expect in this audience there were a lot who knew and uh, crossed trails with Paul along his public career and pathway. And I'll be talking about that in some detail here. Um, for those of you who didn't know Paul or did not have a chance to interact with him personally, I hope I can give you a little bit of background on who he was, why his legacy is worth spending time talking about and why it was worth my spending time a few years working on this collection of his writings. Um, Let me begin with this photo. This is the cover photo, as you just saw. There's the cover, and here's the photo. It was taken actually all the way back before he was a public figure, back in the late 70s, when a National Geographic photographer came through the upper Iowa River and happened upon the Johnson farm along the river and ended up taking some photos of Paul, which we're so grateful for. We tracked down that photographer almost 40 years later now, and we're able to secure this photo, which I just love of Paul. For those of you who know him, you cannot guess why. For those of you who don't, this sort of captures to me so much of Paul in this photo. I could give a whole, I think, talk just on this photo, but I like the fact that he's coming out of the barn. He loved his jerseys, but notice how his nice clean white shirt on. He's probably going to meetings, so that dual reality in Paul's life of being on the farm and being in the public arena is really so much of explains so much of his work and life. And so I'm not going to do a full-length biography of Paul, but I do want to tell you a bit more about him and set the stage and background for him. Paul, this is a later photo in the last couple years of his life. He wasn't a writer per se, but he wrote a lot. And in his later years, especially, he and I talked a lot. I should say at the outset, Paul was a dear friend and mentor to me, as well as a close colleague. And so, especially when it came to writing, he and I compared notes a lot. And um, toward the end of his life, he was really working in the last decade toward writing a book. He really wanted to do that. But he had a lot of other stuff going on in his work life and in his personal life, and he never quite got around to that achieving that goal. But I like to think that this is the book he would like to have produced. And so I did my best to kind of channel him and pay due honor to his hopes. And I'll say that the theme that you kind of assigned me today of talking about agriculture, conservation, and land stewardship, that was really at the core of Paul's writing, his life as a farmer, per, so both in his private and public life. And you'll see that theme reflected. I'll just choose one quote outset. I'll come back to this again later, but from a 1997 document that I'll tell you a bit more about again in a few minutes, um, put out when he was chief of the USDA NRCS. Today, we understand that narrowly circumscribed areas of natural beauty, protected land alone cannot provide the quality of environment people want and need. We must recognize the needs of America's private land and private landowners for us to truly have a geography of hope. This was his great theme. It's not that he was not attentive to or care about public lands. He certainly did. But being in Iowa and being a farmer, he was particularly devoted to raising the profile of conservation on private lands. So again, the theme you chose today is particularly apt. I'll come back to that document, but I'm going to just very quickly take you through a bit of Paul's biography just to give you a little sense of what went into his later career in life. So this is Paul as a young man. He's actually born in California at the outset of World War II, but he was a Midwesterner. He spent time on farms as a youth in South Dakota. He bounced back and forth with his family between the Dakotas and Chicago, time in Wisconsin. So he knew the Midwest and he grew up in our region, and that is a very important part of his story. I'll jump ahead to what I think of as sort of the moment when he began to enter public life and think about a life in public service. So this is an odd photo perhaps to do that with, but I'll tell you the story. He's on the right here in the photo. And this is a photo taken at the airport in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. Paul had an early interest in his career in aeronautical engineering, and he had a pilot's license. And while he was studying that at the University of Illinois, he had a job at the airport in Champaign-Urbana. This is about 1962, as you see here. Well, go back to those years when he was first starting. One of the things he held into the airport was the campaign plane of John F. Kennedy during the presidential campaign in 1960. And Paul actually met the dignitaries, Senator Kennedy and the dignitaries coming off the plane, and as he went into campus in Champaign-Urbana to give this campaign speech. Why is that significant? Because within just a couple years, Paul actually enters public service for the first time as a Peace Corps volunteer in West Africa, in Ghana. And so, being those of you who are of an age like I am, that period of idealistic service on behalf of the public was part of Paul's upbringing and his early professional career. I'm jumping really ahead very quickly here, skipping a lot, but while he's in graduate school, actually in forestry at Michigan, he meets his soon-to-be wife, Pat. And in 1974, he leaves his graduate school program, actually, his PhD, and goes to Iowa. He and his wife purchase a farm just east of Decorah, Iowa, in the driftless part of Iowa, and settle into their life as farmers. And Paul was on the farm while Pat was teaching, and actually at Luther College. Paul did the farm chores and helped raise the kids, and and it was a private life until Paul was sort of drafted. It's a good story I won't go into right now, but Paul almost accidentally became a state assemblyman in Iowa. And as you mentioned, Matt, one of the key, again, this is a very superficial kind of biography, but key contributions, that 1987 Groundwater Act, I'll mention that in a little more detail in a moment, as well as several other key legislative contributions that continue to have impact. Wow, 30, 35 years later, these actions in the legislature still contribute importantly to Iowa's stewardship work. I want you all to think back to 1985 when Paul took office in January 1985, and I don't need to tell anyone on this call or on the Zoom what was happening at that point. Paul took office at the very depth of the farm crisis of the mid 80s, and in fact, the very first piece in this book is Paul writing back to his constituents in Decorah about the first order of business in the legislature, which was in fact dealing with the farm crisis as best they could. So Paul's career in public life, as well as this book, begin with the farm crisis. And I'll come back around later to say it, but one of the hopes I had for this book all along was that, especially for younger people who did not live through this time, it's a real chance to see what was going on in this particular individual's life and mind as he was dealing with this as a public official. It was a and it's one that has, unfortunately, a lot of resonance, of course, with what's going on right now. Another issue that was on the front burner at the time was dealing with groundwater, and Paul became the leader in the legislature in forging what would become not only important in Iowa, but a nationally significant novel piece of legislation to deal with groundwater contamination. So the groundwater passed in early 1987 was a real important part of Paul's legacy, again, not just for Iowa, but really for the country. A lot of other states took a look at what was going on in Iowa. You could give a whole lecture on the importance of the Groundwater Act. For those of you not familiar with it, these are just a very, again, superficial kind of highlights from the act, setting standards and regulations, dealing with wells and testing and plugging abandoned wells. Really important, helping public understand and become aware of groundwater, which has always been one of the more intractable issues we deal with because groundwater is hidden from us. And especially the need for research. And this is a theme I'll come back to a couple times, but Paul always put a priority on supporting research to help inform policy. And of those three centers that were created under the bill, the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture at Iowa State was, again, a move that had statewide, national, and even international repercussions. When you go back and look at that effort, I pulled out this one line from an essay Paul wrote about the act. You see something really different, and he highlights it. The uniqueness of the act lay and it's calling upon all Iowans to develop a conservation ethic through a host of programs in research, education, demonstration. That phrase, a conservation ethic, it may ring for many of you with, again, the work and legacy of another native Iowan, Aldo Leopold. And this is how Paul and I intersect originally, but it's also an important part of the legacy. This is actually really fascinating. On the left there, you see a program, 1986, at Iowa State, honoring the centennial of Aldo Leopold's birth in Burlington, Iowa. I was actually a student and attended that, gave a couple talks at that centennial. They were among my first professional presentations, and I was nervous as could be. But it gave not only me and others involved, but a chance to highlight an aspect of Aldo Leopold's legacy that had been largely overlooked as he became a prominent, globally prominent environmental thinker after Leopold's death in 1949. But back in the 1930s, Leopold was writing quite regularly on the role, as he says here in this 1939 article, of the farmer as a conservationist. Really important writings that had not been published again since Leopold's time. But the centennial event brought this theme forward, being at Ames and being at Iowa State. And this is where Paul really picks up on the Leopold legacy and began to grow his own contributions to that legacy. It, the Iowa Groundwater Act made Paul a national figure. And so he becomes involved in national agricultural science and policy. He becomes a member of the Board on Agriculture at the National Academy of Sciences, the first farmer ever appointed to that board, by the way. And this is again where I intersected. I ended up working in the office of the Board on Agriculture at the NRC in these years. And he and I would cross paths as the National Research Council put out a series of reports on sustainability in agriculture and land use. And I'd particularly draw attention to that one you see in the upper left, a report that came out in 1989. That was a really important step in establishing sustainable agriculture as a concept, as an idea worth exploring and talking about. Although you'll note the title doesn't use the word sustainable because that was not quite yet acceptable to use that term. But within a couple of years, sustainability becomes an organizing theme. And again, Paul and I would work on these projects together. That in turn led Paul just a year or two later to become appointed chief of the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And you'll see this quote from just a year or two after the appointment when Paul Johnson, former Democratic state legislator and folk hero of the sustainable agriculture movement, became chief. He didn't have to travel far to learn why the once venerated agency was in trouble with the farmers it served. All Johnson had to do was listen to his neighbors. I find this a fascinating quote. First of all, it's kind of this backhanded compliment, right, of being the folk hero of this cute sustainable ag movement. That's kind of the implication here, right? Well, Paul served 4 years, and I'm just going to do just a couple slides to remind folks of, again, the history here, and I'm glad you mentioned that at the outset, Paul. Most of you are well aware that the Soil Conservation Service came into being in the 1930s under the helm of Hugh Hammond Bennett, the great soil soil scientist and conservationist, and who became the first chief of what would become Soil Conservation Service in the midst of the Dust Bowl years. And that trajectory over the decades from what was actually originally called the Soil Erosion Service to SCS to NRCS. This story plays out in Paul's writing. Paul was a deep student of the history of conservation in his reading and in his writing. And so you read through this book and you'll pick up a lot of the history that Paul brought into his leadership. A really important part of what made him an effective leader was his awareness of history. I'm going to actually be doing a whole lecture on Paul and the NRCS in January. I'll send a link, Matt, that you can share with folks if they're interested. It's worth spending a lot of time on Paul's NRCS work and legacy. But just for the sake of this presentation, I'll keep it brief. You see the bullets here, some of what he did in his 4-year tenure. in Washington, D.C. And it was not easy for Paul to be in D.C., I should say. There's a constant tension between his wanting to be back on the farm in the place he loved so much and his commitment and sense of responsibility to being in public service. But while he was there, he saw a really important transition in the NRCS. Combining his knowledge of history and his appreciation of the need to innovate really helped him navigate that. You saw the NRCS diversify, you just saw a whole new sense of reinvigoration in the mission. Paul helped to expand it to include topics like wildlife and climate change, agroforestry, and so forth, and a whole raft of new programs developed, especially under the Farm Bill in 1996, and externally helping the NRCS connect with the other federal agencies and with the general public. And again, that final bullet highlighting Paul's role as a true champion of private lands conservation. This document that I showed you at the outset was one of the key products of this. I can't go into detail on all those other accomplishments, but this was one that was close to Paul's heart. Putting together a general report on the state of private lands in the U.S. and making the case for greater attention and commitment to conservation on private lands. There's a great story that behind Paul there at the picnic table is the Aldo Leopold shack outside Baraboo, Wisconsin, near where I live here, where he had taken his. See, there's Max Schnepp, by the way, on the right there. We were talking about him. That Paul liked to bring his folks when they needed to tackle a big project, take them on a retreat in some place that would allow them to think clearly and openly. So they took 3 or 4 days and went off to Baraboo, Wisconsin, with no electricity, no running water, lots of mosquitoes, and drafted the early outline and some pieces of this report that Paul would then issue in the NRCS. And again, it's worth reading this entire report still all these years later. But here's what Paul had to say in his introduction. As we use our land, we paint our individual and community portraits on the land. Done well, those portraits can be a source of pride. He's actually referencing Aldo Leopold in that line. Actually, that's the riff, kind of a riff on Leopold's own statement. And he says this, though, private land needn't be devoted to a single purpose enterprise, with a broad understanding of land and our place within it. Our farms, ranches, and private forest land can and do serve the multiple functions that we and all other life depend on. And I hope I see heads nodding out there because I think this is so much as I understand what you all do. This is really reflecting that mission. Multiple functions, thinking of farms not just as pure factories of production, but serving all the different things we call upon land to help provide us. And again, Paul is referencing some of the history here. I'll just, again, a little slight segue into a bit of the history. This is over on the Wisconsin side of the Mississippi River near Coon Valley, just outside La Crosse. And if any of you have driven down Highway 14 through Coon Valley, you'll have seen this historic marker where in the 1930s, the Coon Creek watershed became the first demonstration project in the country under what would be the Soil Conservation Service. Paul knew this story. He knew that it was an important precedent for what he saw as the vision for the later NRCS, helping to heal these highly erosive watersheds along the driftless area of the upper Mississippi. Late in his life, this is a photo from, I think, 2011. Paul came over to visit and lots of other friends. I won't name them all here, but this is us in Coon Valley overlooking the watershed and telling this story. And Paul brought that story to audiences all over the country because it was such a good early example of that multiple function approach to farming. So just gonna use a couple more slides. I know we're kind of constrained on time here. But thinking of Paul's final, years, he was sidelined. He had a very serious near fatal tractor accident just a couple years after that last photo was taken. And it did give him time, however, to step back and think about the large themes that he had devoted himself to. So here's just a couple statements. deserves an elevated position within mainstream conservation and environmentalism and a societal commitment separate and distinct from its current position as a stepchild of agribusiness dominated farm policy. And of course, this is much on our minds right now as we figure out if and when a new farm bill will come forward. Paul did go on in his public life in other ways to serve. He served as, of course, head of Iowa's DNR for a pretty brief stretch. Tried to get some stuff done, but felt frustrated, frankly, in that role. He he would never stop. He ran for Congress in 2004, a pretty, yeah, let's say, a long shot for someone who called himself an independent Democrat. He did not win that race, but he wanted to get these issues into the public. He wanted people to talk about them, and that was really his goal, I think, in that run. In his later years, he would contribute to lots of different organizations that were devoted to different pieces of this puzzle, and here's just a few of them. From Practical Farmers of Iowa, who many of you, of course, probably are members of, to the Aldo Leopold Foundation, where he is on our board, helping to build the Sustainable Iowa Land Trust, on and on. All these different organizations that Paul served, or at least contributed to in different ways in his later years. And after he passed in early 2021, his family, friends, colleagues created their own small nonprofit, the Johnson Center for Land Stewardship Policy, that I'd encourage you all to explore and learn about. It's still getting on its feet in many ways, just a few years after it was founded. And this book actually is a real important project of the Johnson Center, and I've been trying to help them build their own capacity to help advance these issues. So just a couple last things here, just a couple quotes to take us into conversation. These are from Paul's later years, and I emphasize this to go back to where we started and thinking about Paul taking off in the midst of the farm crisis in the 80s, that end of an arc. And at the other end of the arc are statements like these. Iowa farmers can proudly show the world what they can contribute to reducing climate change while serving multiple functions rather than just growing corn and soybeans. I believe no agriculture is sustainable if it ignores the health of the ecosystem where it operates. So again, the arc from the farm crisis to thinking about the global scale issues of climate change in our food systems. Or I include this one especially for you all, knowing that many of you find yourselves often in days like this out in the field. And emphasis on research, again, a key part of Paul's legacy. The purpose of research isn't to simply to produce more jobs. It's more than that. Now more than ever, our research should be allowed to focus on public as well as private concerns. So just a last summary slide here, and I hope I'm on time, but I actually really appreciate the opportunity to give this talk because it forced me to make this slide, which I know I will use in the future. But how do I think about it? These are broad themes, and I know that most of the webinars you all have are on much more tangible, specific, field focused projects. So this is, stepping back and taking the long-term view and the big picture view and thinking about the trajectory over Paul's life, but he's sort of representative of the larger community of folks in Iowa and beyond who have done this, who've tried to foster ideas about sustainable agriculture and have really created a movement. We forget that even the phrase sustainable agriculture was not in the vocabulary until relatively recently. His commitment to research, education, and especially communicating clearly in the public interest. I've touched on this a few times, how Paul really was a student of history and of conservation and agriculture, and bringing those lessons from history to his public life. Working as we all must and try and continually do to heal divisions between conservation and agriculture. Bringing private land conservation to the foreground, I've emphasized this a lot in the last 20 minutes here, really putting, I'd summarize it this way, that the environmental movement, back in the 70s when some of us oldsters kind of got involved in all this, so much of it was about public land. And private land was kind of forgotten. And Paul did as much as anyone to bring private land back onto the radar screen of conservationists. As a policymaker, he was a pragmatist. He wanted to see results on the ground. And so he was devoted in his role as legislator and agency head to really pragmatic steps that you could see, that you could measure and monitor, and that you could report on as having made a difference. More broadly, Paul was such a great example of honoring public service, not just in agriculture and conservation, but beyond. The idea that is important for all of us to think of ourselves, whether we are in office in a formal way or not, as serving a larger publics, providing the knowledge, information, actions that serve not just ourselves, but our society. And finally, lastly, Paul quietly contributed to the furthering of land ethics in the Aldo Leopold sense, in the idea that we all have responsibilities that go beyond our economics and go beyond the law, even, but really go to our values. And Paul understood this from the beginning. It's what allowed him to be a visionary in his work and to contribute to this ongoing conversation and to help bolster the work that I know all of you do in your capacity as farmers, as teachers and educators, as researchers, or in whatever role you play. So that's what I got for you all today, and I know there's hopefully there's some questions there. And Matt, how am I
There are.
doing?
You're great, Curt. Curt, that was fabulous. I think it really gives us all something to think about, be thankful for uh, individuals such like Paul and others that have set the stage for the work that a lot of us are doing today. I really think that last slide is one that resonates with me, and I think I'm going to get a screenshot of that at some time and post that on my wall because I think in all the work that we do, um, uh, I think all of us can think about those comments and what how we can serve going forward. One other thing, I think the really resonated the multiple functions because that is something I think all of us, many of us on this call, really try to think about. Okay, there are
Mm,
some questions, but I have some logistical slides I need to get to, I think, at the end there, Curt.
yep.
If you watch this webinar live and are wanting a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW at iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today. Include your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. Again, ALENAW at iastate.edu. We can go to the next slide, which I think will be for coming up. Oh yeah, sorry. If you watch this webinar live, and this is your first webinar this year, if you'd fill out a voluntary demographic survey, we'd greatly appreciate it. We just need one survey for 2025 webinars. So if you've done it, thank you very much. If you're willing, you can scan that QR code or go to that survey, iowalearningfarms.org/survey site. Now I think we have a plug for the webinar for next week, which is a little different, but private land. So designing ponds for private landowners. Michael Otten with Shive Hattery is going to talk to us about that. Next slide. And then we have a virtual field day coming up on Thursday, December 4th at 1 o'clock. So not on Wednesday, a little different format, but exploring the impacts of residue management on crop yield and fertilizer inputs. And then one more slide, I think, which would be if you want to go back and watch this or take a view of the great pictures that Curt had in there or any of that, this will be archived. I think my recording worked, so we will have that archive on the iowalearningfarms.org /webinar site, or we have a YouTube channel just for the webinar. So you can go back and watch that a little bit more. And I think with that, that's all those logistical slides. So, Curt, we do have a few questions here. So, the first one, the interesting to see the urge for broadening our production, and something that Paul saw a need for. How can individuals not into farming, but still care, encourage the change for more diversity?
Hmm. Wow, what a great question. I'm sure lots of people on this call would have their own answers too. Here are the things that come to my mind. First of all, famously, Wendell Berry said, if you eat, you're involved in agriculture. So supporting those farmers who are producing in your own region or neighborhood or watershed is so important. And I know I do that right here where I live outside Madison. And I'm blessed here that we have so many producers here who I can turn to literally down the road and help them out. Watershed groups. I don't know how it is in Iowa, but I know in Wisconsin, we've seen this proliferation of farmer-led watershed groups in the last decade, and that's been so important. And it can include others who are not farmers, but who are living in the watersheds. We all live in watersheds, and we should know our watersheds. That's why I brought the Coon Valley picture up. It's so fundamentally important. And if you're not familiar with the watershed or not familiar with the groups who work in your watershed, look into that. Look to see who's working. And that can be the big ones, the Raccoon and the Des Moines and the Iowa and all that, but it's also your little local beds. And I know Steve Hopkins, I hope he's on this call, but how important that's been in his own work to helping people grow in their awareness. And the last thing I'd say is pay attention, if you're not a farmer, to farm policy discussions. Talk to your elected officials. Bring these issues forward. Educate yourself if you can on what. In fact, this book is a pretty good entry point because you see Paul as a policy maker over 30 years explaining what some of the most basic issues are in farm policy. Again, if folks who aren't farmers, you may not know a lot about the Farm Bill or about the origins of the Conservation Reserve Program, et cetera, et cetera. About a third of the book is pretty wonky policy stuff. And if you read through that, at least you'll learn the terminology and the vocabulary that those of us who are involved a little more use on a daily basis.
Okay. Next one. The idea of speaking to values feels quaint in today's climate. How do you think Paul would approach these conservations kind of in our, I guess, the climate that we have today?
Wow. Yeah, I get it. And I've been in that space myself for a long time. And, that's part of the legacy not only of Aldo Leopold, but of voices of conservation. And I will quickly add indigenous voices of land stewardship going back generations and millennia. Everything involves values, whether we articulate it or not. Getting comfortable with speaking about that and understanding it is another question. And boy, I'm thinking of a journal right now, Agriculture and Human Values, that I've occasionally contributed to. There's a whole journal devoted to how people working in agriculture, whatever your entry point in agriculture is, how we understand how the values are embedded and reflected. So that's lifelong work, right? That's not just read a book and you're done. That's contemplation and thinking about you and your place and your neighbors and your family and your food system and your ecosystem. That's lifelong work. And just getting comfortable with the idea of having to articulate and finding the common ground. This is what it's all about. Paul had strong principles and views, but he was always open to talking, even with people who were very different in their own perspectives than he was. Again, that seems almost quaint, as the question said, these days when we're so divided and polarized. But it's also the place where we can come together. We all care about the land. We all care about healthy food. We all care about our rural communities. And we all care about connecting our urban and rural communities together in better ways. So I just encourage you to start on I think everyone on this call is already well along on the journey of thinking about their values and how it plays out in this work. We all continue on that journey. And that's another, I'll quote another good friend of ours, Pete Nowak. Some of you may know Pete from his retired know over in Wisconsin. He once said, conservation is not a program or a plan. Conservation's a journey.
Yeah.
I've always loved that quote because it is. It's a personal and social journey we are all on together. And the more we can do to connect and find our common ground, the better we're all going to be.
Okay. Thanks. Next one is, um, what do you think Paul and Aldo, for that matter, might think about the state of agriculture and conservation in Iowa and the Midwest? And what items would they flag as maybe not being prioritized, or maybe another way, missed opportunities?
Hmm. Well, there's a little joke I have had over the years of, especially when I'm asked about Leopold, I say, "Don't ask me what Leopold would have thought about anything." I He was too complicated and unpredictable a thinker. In this case, I feel a little more confident. The first thing that comes to my head on that is both of them had this instinct for thinking about history and stories, right? For understanding that the issues of our day, as important and difficult as they are embedded in history. And the better we understand that history, the better and perhaps more humble we will be about trying to address them. And in agriculture, so much of that involves all the changes that happened after World War II, right? As we embarked on the trend that we now see, especially toward greater and greater concentration, commodification, consolidation in agriculture. We all know this. It's not a secret anymore, and it's still difficult to talk about because it involves politics, and we don't want to always do that, especially when we get tired of it with Thanksgiving coming and probably some table conversations about to ensue, right? But the more we know that history, the better perhaps we can navigate this. So I think a lot about this. Leopold died just after World War II. Toward the ends of his life, he was predicting that we were going to face this kind of dilemma between the industrialization of agriculture and all that that would mean for rural communities and lifeways, and agriculture as producing food and farms, as Leopold said, as places to live, not just as factories. So we're still in the middle of that epic debate that it's a global debate. This is where the conversation is happening. So I keep going back to history and I'm saying if we can frame the moment we're in more broadly, we can deal with the issues of the day that are critical. In Iowa, that's surface water quality. I know. I've been paying attention to Iowa, and you can't avoid that even if you live in Wisconsin. You see the news articles coming out of Iowa. But we can see positive trends too when we look at that history. So many we can choose. Think of practical farmers of Iowa and how they were able to respond to the farm crisis in the 80s by bringing people together in new and different ways. Or think of the growth of farmers markets in the last 20, 25 years. When I'm talking to students, I'll sometimes joke and I'll say, "You don't think there's a lively food movement that has changed the way we eat? Ask your parents when they were college students how they ate."
Yeah.
That's my joke,
Yeah.
right? Because it was young people, especially those who were, attending college
Yeah.
back 20 years ago, said we want better food, and it really was important. So there's all kinds of trends that are both encouraging as well as discouraging. And to understand those trends, I'd say, take some time out to learn that history. And again, that's one thing I hope this book of Paul's writing really helps, especially younger people, to get a little sense of historical framing for their thinking on these issues.
Yeah. Um, we got time for a couple more, I think, if anybody has one, but we have one here. What are the wildlife influences that Paul Johnson was involved with and promoted, or
Oh
promotion
boy,
of?
great question. Well, I mentioned that Paul was trained as a forester actually in Michigan, and it was his shift toward farming that really kind of altered the trajectory that and all that he would influence. But as a forester, he would have been exposed to, of course, training in wildlife management and ecology. Um, but when he began to focus on private lands and agriculture in his national policy role at the NRCS, he helped create within NRCS a new center for wildlife management. That was a key part of his contribution was, again, he inherited an agency that was epic in its contributions to soil conservation and had always done other aspects of conservation, whether it was water, or wildlife, or forestry, or whatever. But Paul really wanted to emphasize that soil is where our foundation is, but we have always worked on these other issues to the point where he created new entities within the agency to give greater strength to those. So, And his so that was one aspect of his ability to bring that focus on wildlife and more broadly biodiversity, let's say. And so now we see, of course, so much interest in whether it's pollinators or native vegetation or so forth. And in Iowa, which has so little public land, Paul saw that every farmer had an opportunity to bring a little more wildness back to the farm.
Um, Another one here. Do you have any suggestions of conservation measures you'd want to see more to be better private property stewards of multifunctional systems?
Hmm. Boy, we know so much more than we did 25, 20 years ago, and the old timers will tell you that. We know what we need to do. It's the economic side of it, it's the cultural, social dimensions of this that are so challenging to work through. But I'll tell you the first thing that popped into my head when you said that was, or when the question was asked, was to think about our pieces of land that we happen to, quote, own temporarily in our care. Um, But we have neighbors, and we all exist within larger communities and watersheds and flyways and species ranges. And to be able to think simultaneously about our piece of the puzzle as well as the whole puzzle. We started to do more and more of this in the 90s under the rubric of ecosystem management or other terms we used, community-based conservation. We always need to be thinking because what happens beyond us affects what happens within our property boundaries and vice versa. And getting that set of relationships straight is what it's always all about. And this goes all again, all the way back to Leopold and others in the 1930s and 40s. So, particular practices, we have a long menu. And there are people on this call who know way, way more about any one of those pieces than I ever will, like developing ponds and private lands, your next week's seminar.
Yeah.
There's so many different opportunities, and it's all unique to your own place and where you are and your own ecosystem setting. But always to be thinking at the scale of our own place and the larger, again, landscape and watersheds, particularly watersheds, helps us to navigate that and ask what's the most appropriate thing we can do here and what's the most necessary thing.
And which one might give us those multifunctions that we want? Because
Right.
yeah, yeah. Uh, okay, yeah. Here's maybe one. We'll
These are great
hopefully.
questions.
Oh yeah,
Really
yeah.
appreciate them.
It is, and we got one. That I hope it's not a downer. We're not going to end. We're going to end on something positive, but as we think about it. But one person says that they suggest that not enough discussion happens to rural areas as places where people live since the exodus from rural America to urban areas, driven the movement from not caring maybe about rural well water pollution. What did Paul think about the exodus from rural Iowa and the reduction of the number of farms?
Boy, yeah, great question. Paul was witness to this, of course, and he grew up in a time when he witnessed sort of it wasn't the largest. We began to be a more urban country back well, all the way back to the 20s.
Yeah.
But that post-war period of the 1950s, 60s, Paul's youth, time of his youth, was when our rural communities were probably at their most vibrant in terms of economics, demographics, etc. So he thoroughly understood what was happening with the repercussions of industrialization and consolidation. He understood and lived that. And he understood that this wasn't just a social problem. This was also an ecological, environmental dimension to this. And connecting those was what he was all about. The term of art we use in ecology is these are socio-ecological systems. Every ecosystem is the quote natural system as well as the human social system. And once we adopt that kind of frame, we begin to see that the unintended consequences of the trends following World War II is what brought us to where we are. Paul also thought about this politically, I would say. He understood that so much of the divide between urban and rural America is a consequence of that, of the was I sometimes like to boil it down, the industrialization of the rural countryside and the deindustrialization of our urban manufacturing centers
Mhm.
too. And this has put us in this really awful political moment we find ourselves with the divide between urban and rural communities. Paul was a voice for trying to find a way forward that would recognize the common interest, the shared interest in land, water, biodiversity, clean water, etc. So I would say in general, it's kind of Paul doesn't explicitly write about that much, but it's and pervasive in everything he
Yeah.
wrote. It's just sort of the background.
Okay. And I think that's, maybe a good way to end is, how do we find those ways to come together on all these things? Because I think, so many people care about water, air, biodiversity. Uh, Somebody said, I doubt Paul could have foreseen AI energy complexes and the enormous amount of water usage and energy that
It's
we see
true.
right now. That might be true. And so, um,
It's true he didn't mention
yeah,
data
yeah,
centers, you know,
okay, yeah,
but
yeah,
it's upon us now.
yes, that
Hey,
that
I'd like to just mention
yeah,
before we end up that I
yeah.
will be doing some more events. I know we got coming up in Iowa City on the 12th, I think. And then come spring, I'll be with the Savannah Institute off in
Okay.
Dubuque at their gathering in Dubuque. So if anyone has questions or would like to talk more on this, I would love to meet you all in person. That's much better than Zoom.
Yeah. Well, yes, it is much better in Zoom, but boy, Curt, this is thank you so very much for presenting today, for your work on the book, for your work over the years, and for you know carrying on so many of the things that Paul worked his whole career on. I think there's so many things as we think about the Thanksgiving time. It's so many things to be thankful for, so much more work to do. But I think it's always important to be thankful for the things that have been done and thankful for people like Paul that have done so very much in this area. So with that, again, thanks, Curt. Thanks everybody for attending. I hope you have a great Thanksgiving holiday, and I hope that we get to see you on a webinar coming up in December or in the new year. So let give you any last comments if you want, Curt.
I just say again, thank you. Being Thanksgiving to you, Matt, and to the learning farms. I really enjoyed learning about what you all are about. I didn't know of the program before. And again, thank you to everyone who joined us on a pre-holiday day. And
Yeah,
stay warm and as
yeah,
the first blizzards come through.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, everybody stay safe and travel safe if you are traveling. So.